It was 4:47 in the morning when Daniel finally reached the last stop on Route 14. The city outside the windshield was a strange kind of quiet, not the quiet of peace, but the quiet that falls between exhaustion and dawn when even the wind seems to hold its breath. The orange glow of streetlights stretched across the empty boulevard, and the hum of the bus engine was the only sound that reminded Daniel he was still awake, still moving, still showing up. Daniel had been driving the night bus for 11 years. He knew every pothole on the route, every traffic light that flickered before it changed, every shortcut through the industrial district that saved exactly 3 minutes on a bad night. He knew the city the way only people who work, while it sleeps, truly know it. Not as a place of glamour or opportunity, but as a machine that needed tending, a wheel that never stopped turning, and a life that demanded his presence whether he was rested or not. He was 42 years old. He was not rich. He was not famous. He drove the bus, paid his bills on time, and kept a small apartment near the transit depot with a window that faced east. He had learned over 11 years to fall asleep before the sun finished rising. That was his life, and for a long time he had told himself it was enough. On this particular morning, something shifted. As Daniel rounded the corner near the glass towers of the financial district, the back of the bus erupted with the kind of laughter that carries no real joy, loud, performative, rehearsed. A group of 4 young men in tailored suits had been on the bus since the downtown cocktail bar stop. They were somewhere between 30 and 35, their cologne mixing in the recycled air, their voices filling every corner of the vehicle with a casual arrogance that seemed entirely unconscious. One of them, the tallest, with a loosened tie and a watch that caught the streetlight like a mirror, was explaining to the others that his portfolio had dropped. Not collapsed, not crashed, just dipped. And yet the way he spoke about it, you would have thought the world had turned against him personally. 4,000 gone in a week, he said, shaking his head. I'm telling you, the market is brutal right now. The others nodded with the gravity of men discussing genuine suffering. Another one laughed softly and pulled out his phone, scrolling through something with practiced boredom. I put half my bonus into that tech fund, he said. The other half went on the watch. So you know, at least the watch is still worth something. More laughter. Someone mentioned an apartment upgrade. Someone else mentioned a car lease. The conversation moved seamlessly between expense and complaint, between having and wanting, between earning more and somehow never having quite enough. Daniel watched them in the rearview mirror with the particular stillness of a man who's learned not to react. He had been watching people like this for years, people who earned in a month what he earned in a year, and yet who seemed to carry a kind of low-grade anxiety that never fully lifted. They upgraded everything and were satisfied with nothing. They talked about money constantly and seemed to understand it least of all. He did not resent them. He simply observed them, the way you observe weather, something powerful, impersonal, and ultimately beyond your control. The final stop approached. The young men gathered their jackets, their phones, their weekend bags. One of them, as he stepped off the bus, glanced back at Daniel the way certain people glance at service workers, a look that is not cruel exactly, but that registers nothing, a non-look, a habit. Daniel closed the doors behind them and sat alone in the silence of the bus, the engine still running, the city holding its breath around him. There was a small square 2 blocks from the transit depot where Daniel often stopped before heading home. It was nothing special, a patch of old concrete, 4 wooden benches, a dormant fountain that the city had stopped maintaining years ago, and a handful of pigeons that seemed to live there permanently regardless of season. Daniel had discovered it by accident during his first year on the route, when a traffic delay had sent him down an unfamiliar street. He had never stopped going back. The old man was always there. That was the first thing you noticed about him. Not his face, not his clothes, but his constancy. He was there before Daniel arrived, and seemed to have been there for hours already. He sat on the same bench, in the same posture, scattering seeds from a small paper bag, with movements so practiced they had become a kind of meditation. The pigeons knew him. They gathered without alarm, stepping around his feet with the trust of animals that have never been deceived. His name, Daniel would later learn, was Mr. Aurelio. He was 73 years old. He wore the same kind of clothes every day. Clean, simple, unremarkable. A grey jacket, dark trousers, shoes that were old but polished. He did not wear a watch. He did not carry a phone. He sat in the early morning quiet with the ease of someone who had nothing urgent to do and had made peace with that fact entirely. In a city that performed busyness as a virtue, he was a small and radical act of stillness. For the first few weeks, Daniel simply sat nearby, drinking cheap coffee from the vending machine at the depot entrance, and the old man fed his birds. They did not speak. There was an unspoken agreement of shared silence that felt more comfortable than most conversations Daniel had in a day. He did not know why he kept returning. Perhaps it was the quiet. Perhaps it was the absence of complaint. Perhaps it was simply that the bench faced east, and the light on early mornings was, in its way, extraordinary. Then one Tuesday morning in October, without warning or preamble, Mr. Aurelio spoke. He did not look up from the pigeons. He did not change his posture. He simply said, in a voice that was calm and entirely certain, "Most people chase money their whole lives, but the quiet money is the one that wins." Daniel looked at him. The old man finally glanced over, and there was something in his eyes that was not quite amusement, but was adjacent to it. The look of a person who has known something for a long time and has simply been waiting for the right moment to say it out loud. Daniel did not know how to respond, so he said the most honest thing he could think of. "What does that mean?" The old man nodded slowly, as if this was exactly the right question. And then he began to talk. Mr. Aurelio did not lecture. That was the first thing Daniel noticed about how he spoke. He did not position himself as someone with answers who had found a student. He simply talked, the way you talk when you're thinking aloud, carefully, honestly, in no particular hurry. And he talked about traps, 3 of them, specifically. 3 habits he had watched consume the financial lives of nearly everyone he had known. 3 patterns that looked like progress from the outside and functioned like quicksand from within. The first trap, he said, was lifestyle inflation. He described it simply. Every time a person earns more, they spend more. A raise comes, and suddenly the apartment feels too small. A promotion arrives, and the car becomes embarrassing. A good year happens, and the holiday becomes longer, more expensive, more elaborate. The spending always expands to fill the income, and then a little beyond. People think they're rewarding themselves, he said, but they're actually raising the floor of what they need to feel normal. Every upgrade becomes the new baseline, and the baseline never comes back down. Daniel thought about his own life. He thought about the years when he had earned slightly more, a short stint in logistics, a period of double shifts, and how the money had moved through him like water through open hands, a better television, takeout instead of cooking, a gym membership he used twice. Nothing wrong with any of it, nothing terrible. Just money that arrived and departed without leaving anything behind. He had never thought of it as inflation. He'd thought of it as living. But sitting on that bench in the early morning light, he began to wonder if there was a difference. The second trap, Mr. Aurelio continued, was status spending. This one was more subtle, he said, more dangerous because it wore the costume of personal choice. Status spending was not buying what you needed or even what you genuinely wanted. It was buying what you wanted other people to see you own. The watch that announced success. The car that whispered ambition. The apartment in the right neighborhood, the holiday to the right destination, the restaurant where the right kind of people go. "We spend," he said quietly, "to write a story about ourselves for an audience that is too busy writing their own story to read ours." Daniel thought again of the young men on the bus. The watch. The portfolio complaint performed for friends. The casual mention of the bonus. He had always assumed that people who earned that much had figured something out, that the anxiety he sensed beneath their laughter was temporary, a phase before true security arrived. But what if the anxiety was the point? What if the spending was not our reward for success, but a symptom of insecurity wearing success as a mask? The thought sat uncomfortably in his chest, like a door opening onto a room he hadn't known was there. The third trap was the one that Mr. Aurelio seemed to hold most gently, as if it knew it was the most painful. He called it waiting for the big win. The idea that real financial change would come from something large, a windfall, a promotion, an inheritance, a lucky investment, a business idea that finally clicked. The belief that small actions were not worth taking because the gap between where you were and where you wanted to be was too large to close one small step at a time. People wait for the moment, he said. And while they wait, the moment that actually changes everything is passing them by, invisible, disguised as something too ordinary to notice, with Daniel for years afterward. He said, "I never earned a large salary. I never had a windfall. I never made a spectacular investment that changed everything overnight. What I did was plant seeds every month for 40 years into the same ground. I did it when the ground seemed frozen. I did it when other people told me the ground wasn't worth planting in. I did it when I was tired, when I was uncertain, when the amount I was planting felt so small, it seemed almost pointless." He stopped. He looked at his hands. "The tree that grew from that," he said, "gives shade I never could have imagined when it planted the first seed." Daniel drove home that morning thinking about seeds. He thought about them through the blurred half-sleep of the day, through the afternoon when the city grew loud outside his east-facing window, through the evening when he rose and made coffee and prepared for another shift. He thought about what it would mean to plant something and not see it grow. To act on faith in a process rather than waiting for proof. To accept that the most important financial decisions of a life are the ones that produce no immediate visible result. He began, as gently as turning a page, to look at his own finances with new eyes. What he found was not catastrophic. It was not dramatic. It was simply ordinary. The ordinary accumulation of small, unconscious decisions made without a plan, a streaming subscription he had forgotten about, a credit card balance that never quite cleared because he always paid the minimum and something always came up before he could pay more, a savings account that had barely moved in 3 years because he kept intending to add to it next month. When things calmed down, when there was a little extra, there was never extra, there was never calm. He understood that now in a way he had not before. The extra was not coming from somewhere outside his current income. It was waiting inside it, hidden beneath habits he had never examined, the dinner out on tired evenings instead of cooking, the upgrade to a newer phone when the old one worked perfectly well, the lottery ticket he bought every week as a kind of ritualized hope, a standing order placed with the universe that never delivered. These were not sins. They were not failures. They were simply the cost of living without a direction. He started impossibly small by the standards of financial advice he had half read in articles over the years. He set aside $40 from every paycheck into an account he called, in his phone's notes app, the Seed account. Not because $40 would change his life, but because the act of doing it consistently, of treating it as non-negotiable, of planting it in the same ground every month regardless of how the rest of the month had gone, this was the practice. This was the muscle he was building. Not wealth. Not yet. The habit of wealth. He started reading, not complicated books, not trading strategies or schemes, simple things, how compound interest worked, what an index fund was, why time in the market mattered more than timing the market. He read slowly, in the quiet hours before his shift, and the more he read, the more he felt something shift inside him. Not excitement exactly, something quieter than that. Clarity, maybe. The feeling of a map appearing where there had only been fog. He thought often about the young professionals on the bus. He did not think about them with pity or superiority. He had no room for either. He thought about them as a kind of cautionary image, a photograph of a particular way of being in the world that looked like success and felt like running. High income, rising expenses, constant anxiety, no foundation. A beautiful building constructed on sand. He did not want that. He had never wanted that, even when he had envied it. What he wanted, he was beginning to understand, was something that most people never bothered to name because it was so simple it sounded like not wanting. Peace. Genuine financial peace. The kind that doesn't require performance. The months passed, then seasons, then years. The transformation Daniel underwent was not the kind that makes good television. There was no single dramatic moment, no sudden reversal, no before and after revelation. There was only the quiet, patient accumulation of small correct actions repeated until they became invisible, until they became simply the way he lived. The $40 became 60, then 80. Then, as he found other small leaks in his financial life and redirected them, 120. Not because his salary had dramatically changed, because his relationship to his salary had. He stopped upgrading things that already worked. He learned to find a strange satisfaction in this, a kind of quiet pride in the old phone that still functioned, the shoes that were resoled rather than replaced, the coffee made at home rather than purchased from the cart outside the depot. These were not sacrifices in the way the word is usually meant. They were choices. And there's a profound difference between a sacrifice and a choice, even when the action looks identical from the outside. One depletes you. The other quietly builds you. The seed account grew, slowly, then less slowly. The compound interest, that phenomenon he had read about in those early morning hours before shifts, began to do the thing it does, the thing that seems miraculous until you understand it, and then seems simply logical. It made money from money. Small amounts of money making slightly less small amounts of money, which made more. The tree was underground still, but the roots were reaching. Hestill drove the night bus. He still knew every pothole on Route 14, every flickering traffic light, every 3-minute shortcut through the industrial district. He still sat in the small square near the depot most mornings, drinking cheap coffee and watching the light change. Mr. Aurelio was still there, still feeding the same pigeons, still speaking in that unhurried way that suggested time was something to be used rather than fought. Their conversations deepened. Daniel brought questions, the old man brought patience. It was, Daniel thought, the most valuable education he had ever received, and it cost him nothing but attention. He learned that Mr. Aurelio had worked for 40 years as a mid-level accountant at a firm that no longer existed. He had never earned a spectacular salary. He'd never inherited wealth or received a windfall. He had simply, quietly, consistently planted money into index funds from the age of 28, first small amounts, then gradually larger ones, and had refused to stop, refused to panic during market downturns, refused to be seduced by the promise of faster returns from more complex strategies. He had lived below his means not because he was deprived, but because he understood, at a cellular level, what he actually needed to be content. He owned his apartment outright. He had no debt. His investments generated enough passive income that he had stopped needing to work 6 years before, though he'd chosen to continue for a while because the work had given him purpose. He fed pigeons in the early morning and spoke with bus drivers and felt, he said once with a quiet smile, like the freest man in the city. Not the freest. He was careful about that distinction. He understood that they were not the same thing. 7 years after that first conversation on the bench, Daniel sat in the same square in the early morning light. The fountain was still dormant. The bench was still wooden and worn. The pigeons were different birds now, probably, but they behaved exactly the same, strutting with the same unhurried confidence around the same feet. The light was coming in low from the east, golden and patient, the way it only arrives in that specific 30-minute window before the city fully wakes. Mr. Aurelio had passed away 2 winters ago. Daniel had learned about it from a notice on the bench, a small card in a plastic sleeve, placed by a nephew who lived in another city. He had sat with that news for a long time. Not with grief exactly, or not only grief, but with the particular feeling of realizing that someone had given you something irreplaceable without ever announcing it as a gift. The old man had never told Daniel what to do. He had never presented himself as a teacher. He had simply been present and honest and patient, and that had been enough. Daniel's own finances had changed quietly over those 7 years. His investments were not large by the standards of the people who wrote books about money or appeared on financial television, but they were real. They were growing. His seed account had become a portfolio, modest, diversified, boring in all the right ways. He had paid off the credit card balance in full 3 years ago and had never carried a balance since. He had built a small emergency fund that sat in a high-yield savings account and served more than anything as a psychological foundation. The knowledge that a setback would not become a catastrophe and was not wealthy by the definition used on the bus that night 11 years ago. He could not complain about a portfolio dip of $4,000. He could not joke about a bonus covering a luxury watch. But he could, and this was the thing, the quiet, extraordinary thing. Sit in this square in the early morning and feel no anxiety about the future, not the performed contentment of someone who has given up on wanting more. The genuine peace of someone who has built something that will outlast any single paycheck, any single setback, any single bad year. He thought about the young professionals, or people like them, because the faces changed but the conversation never seemed to, who still got on and off his biz in the financial district in the early hours of the morning. He thought about them without judgment now. They were not villains in his story. They were simply people who had been given a script that measured everything by its immediate visible value, and who had followed it faithfully, the salary that needed to be displayed, the object that needed to be owned, the story that needed to be told. He hoped for them what Mr. Aurelio had given him. Not wealth, exactly, but perspective. The kind of perspective that changes not what you earn, but what you do with it. A pigeon landed near his feet and looked at him with the unsentimental directness of an animal assessing whether he had food. He did not. The pigeon considered this for a moment, and then walked away with the dignity of a creature that hastes other options. Daniel watched it go and smiled. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small paper bag of seeds, a habit he had picked up without quite deciding to, one morning about a year after Mr. Aurelio's bench card had appeared. He opened it and scattered a handful on the ground. The pigeon turned around. Others came. He sat with them in the quiet morning light. This ordinary man who had built an invisible foundation under an ordinary life and felt something that most people spend their entire financial lives in search of and somehow never find enough. Not the desperate enough of resignation, but the generous enough of someone who has quietly and patiently and without any audience at all done the work, planted the seeds, let the roots grow, and waited with faith and without hurry for the tree. Daniel never became rich in the way the world usually measures richness. He never stopped driving the night bus. He never moved to a bigger apartment or bought a newer car or posted vacation photos from places designed to impress people he barely knew. What he did was something quieter and, in the end, far more radical. He stopped spending his present to perform a version of his future and started investing his present in the actual future he wanted. The old man on the bench had given him a sentence. The quiet money is the one that wins, and that sentence had opened a door. But Daniel had walked through it himself, one small decision at a time, one planted seed at a time. 1 month, and then another after that, until the habit became the life, and the life became the freedom, and the freedom became so natural that he could almost forget it had ever been otherwise. Almost, but not quite. Because every morning, when the sun came up over the small square and the pigeons gathered and the city slowly, reluctantly began to wake, Daniel remembered exactly where he had come from and was grateful in the deep and quiet way of a man who has earned his peace for every single step of the journey.